Thank you very much, Attorney Nemo, for the introduction and for the continuation of our podcast tonight, The Legal Pill. I'll be discussing to you construction and interpretation of tax law. Question: what is the rule in construction and interpretation of tax law? Answer: as a general rule, tax laws are liberally construed in favor of the taxpayer and strictly against the government. What do you mean by liberally construed? It means that the interpretation shall not be only based on the actual words or phrases used in it, but also by taking its deemed or stated purpose into account. The goal of the liberal construction is to give full effect in implementing a statute's requirements. When does it favor the taxpayer and be strictly against the government? When there is doubt, tax laws must be construed strictly against the government and in favor of the taxpayer. Can it be presumed? No, unless a statute imposes a tax clearly, expressly, and unambiguously. What applies is the equally well settled rule that the imposition of a tax cannot be presumed. Can it be by implication? No. According to the general rule of requiring adherence to the letter in construing statutes applies with peculiar strictness to tax laws, and the provision of a taxing act are not to be extended by implication. As the Supreme Court held in their decision in the Commission of Internal Revenue versus the Philippine Airlines Incorporated, that tax cannot be imposed without clear and express word for that purpose. Without presumption and implication, the law becomes clear and what is left is to apply and implement it. In the case of E-Card versus the City Council of Baguio, the Supreme Court held that the municipal corporation, like the City of Baguio, has no inherent power on taxation, unlike the sovereign state. The City of Baguio may not levy taxes as it pleases, but only as the legislature may specifically provide. No specific provision in the charter of that city empowering it to levy such taxes. The principle is that the power of a municipal corporation to tax, in order to exist, must be granted expressly, never impliedly or inferentially. The power when granted is to be construed in strictissimi juris or according to the strictest interpretation of the law. In the case of the Republic of the Philippines versus Ablasa, the Supreme Court upheld that the law on prescription, being a remedial measure, should be interpreted in a way conducive to bringing about the beneficent purpose of affording protection to the taxpayer within the contemplation of the Commission which recommend the approval of the law. Question: what is the general rule in tax exemption? The rule in exemption from taxation are construed in strictissimi juris against the taxpayer and liberally in favor of the taxing authority. How does tax exemption differ from tax law? If the tax law is to be construed liberally in favor of the taxpayer and strictly against the government, the reverse of the rule will be applied for the construction of tax exemption. When does it favor the government and be against the taxpayer? If there is doubt whether a tax exemption exists, it must be resolved against the taxpayer. In the case of Atlas Consolidated Mining versus the Commission of Internal Revenue, the issue in this case relevant to this topic is that whether or not Atlas is entitled to claim to a tax refund. According to the Supreme Court, Atlas' claim for credit or refund of input taxes cannot be granted due to its failure to show convincingly that the same has not been applied to any of its output tax liability as provided under Section 106, Paragraph A of the Tax Code. A claim of refund or exemption from tax payment must be clearly shown and be based on language in the law too plain to be mistaken. Elsewise stated, taxation is the rule, exemption therefrom is the exemption. Question: what is tax refund? Taken from the decision cited in the case of Fort Bonifacio Development Corporation versus the Commission of Internal Revenue, the Supreme Court held that tax refund is defined as money that a taxpayer overpaid and is thus returned by the taxing authority. Why is the government enforcing tax refund provision in strictissimi juris to the one claiming it? It is because tax refunds are in the nature of tax exemption, and as such, they are regarded as in derogation of sovereign authority and to be construed strictissimi juris against the person or entity claiming the exemption. What is tax amnesty? In the case of Asia International Auctioneer versus the Commission of Internal Revenue, decided by the Supreme Court, defined it as a general pardon or intentional overlooking by the state of its authority to impose penalty on person otherwise guilty of violating a tax law. It partakes an absolute waiver by the government of its right to collect and what is due it, and to give tax evader who wish to relent a chance to start with a clean slate. In the case of Asia International Auctioneer versus the Commission of Internal Revenue, whether or not the contention of the Commission of Internal Revenue that Asia International Auctioneer is disqualified from availing itself of the tax amnesty program because it is deemed a withholding agent for the deficiency tax, the Supreme Court held that the contention of the Commission of Internal Revenue is untenable. The CIR did not assess the Asia International Auctioneer as a withholding agent that failed it to withhold or remit the deficiency VAT or excise tax to the BIR under the relevant provision of the tax code. Hence, the argument that the Asia International Auctioneer is deemed a withholding agent for these deficiency taxes is faulty. Why is the state so strict when it comes to payment of tax on time and imposing penalties for non-payment? It is because tax laws imposing penalties for delinquencies are clearly intended to hasten tax payment or to punish evasion or neglect of duty in respect thereof. If delays of tax payments are to be condoned for light reason, the law imposing penalties for delinquencies would be rendered nugatory, and the maintenance of the government and its multifarious activities would be as precarious as taxpayers are willing or unwilling to pay their obligation to the state in time. In the case of Hamora versus Mir, it is not disputed that plaintiff's remittance was deposited in the mail after the closing hours of March 29, 1939. However, the Supreme Court held that under Executive Order No. 92, Series of 1927, a taxpayer who makes a remittance through the mails of either money order, cash, or check covering a tax due from him should be considered delinquent and subject to the payment of a surcharge or statutory penalty. Tax laws imposing penalties for delinquencies are clearly intended to hasten tax payment or to punish evasion or neglect of duty in respect thereof. So with this, classmates and friends, I hope that we learn a lot from this discussion. And to continue on our podcast tonight, Attorney Sophia will be discussing to us naturalization law. Take it on, Attorney Sophia.